My friend and I were at a carnival one time, and we saw a man throwing knives against a wall. You might ask, what's so remarkable about that? So we got a little closer, and we realized there was a man standing at the wall with knives being thrown at him. We were transfixed. As the knives twirled through the air and thudded into the wall, inches, no millimeters from the man at the wall, and they were all around him. After about 10 knives were thrown, my friend turned to me and said, "Do you believe the next knife that's thrown will be accurate?" Well, I thought for a moment, and I said, "Well, he's done so pretty good so far. I believe the next knife will be accurate." He prodded me a little bit further, and he said, "Do you have faith?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" My friend turned to me and said, "Could you have the faith required to go and stand at the wall?" Wow. I guess the purpose of that story is to indicate to you that there's a subtle difference between believing something and having faith. You know, quite often Christians are accused of having what is called blind faith. You know, a faith that's not really based on any kind of substance or evidence. You just have to trust this higher power without any kind of questioning. My belief that the knife thrower could be 100% accurate was quite different than the faith shown by the young man standing at the wall. I mean, think about it. That just didn't happen overnight. The knife thrower and the young man must have practiced. They must have had shared experiences and built a relationship over time so that he could trust him and have faith in him. My goal today is to share with you some examples from history and some personal examples to help you to develop this kind of faith, the kind of faith that can help you to overcome mistakes you've made in the past, to persevere through experiences that you might be having currently, and have confidence to move forward without fearing, without having stress and anxiety that can so easily overtake us. I hope you can learn to live in faith, not fear. The first example I'd like to share with you is a historical example from the Bible, from Daniel chapter 3. Perhaps you've heard of the story of 3 men who came through a fiery furnace unscathed. Perhaps you know of them as from their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I like to remember their Hebrew names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But before we get to the example of the fiery furnace, we need to wind the clock back a little bit. You know, it began for these young men, perhaps even just teenagers, in the land of Israel where they grew up. In fact, they were probably princes of the land. Babylon had come and destroyed the nation of Israel and were taking captives away into Babylon. That's a distance about 900 miles. You know, in 600 BC, when Babylon was a great empire, that's when these men lived. Today, if you go to Babylon, it's in ruins. But at that time, it was a mighty power. These men had been taken away from their homes. Perhaps their parents were killed. Their king was taken away. Their temple was destroyed. And yet they endured a burning fiery furnace. How did that even happen? I can think of at least 2 reasons. You know, one would be that the prophets of God had predicted that Babylon would come, that Babylon would take them into captivity. We can see in Jeremiah 20, verse 5, that God had predicted these things through his prophets. And so these young men, despite the circumstances around them, were confident that God was still in control. I mean, it looked like Babylon had won. But God was in control, and that would have given them confidence. Yes, it took faith in those circumstances, but it was a faith based on what God had told them. Secondly, not only had the prophets of God told the Israelites that they would go into captivity in Babylon, it told them a timeline. It gave them a prescription for life. In Jeremiah 29, verse 5 through 10, we can see that they were told to build homes, to establish families, to seek the peace of that city and to multiply while they were there. Why? Because it was going to be 70 years and they would come back. That section in Jeremiah ends with this beautiful assurance from God. It says, "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not evil, to give you a hope and a future." So yes, things seemed grim for these young men as they trundled across the desert as captive slaves, chosen to be in the king of Babylon's courts. And yet they had something to hold on to, that God was with them, even in that difficult circumstance. They had confidence to show faith when all around them people were probably quivering in fear. This faith that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah had wasn't blind. It was based on the evidence of God's revealed word and the experiences that they had in their lives. It's the kind of faith that can make sense of the past, give you strength for the present, and a hope and an assurance for the future. So these men were in Babylon, and it was about to get really personal for them. It was time for them to walk out to that wall and stand in front of the knife thrower. Except, as we'll see, for them it was a flamethrower. King Nebuchadnezzar, in his pride, had built an image 90 feet tall. It was probably in his likeness. And he had gathered together from his empire all his officials. And they were called before them. The instructions are pretty clear, as we're told in Daniel chapter 3. When you hear all kinds of music being played, bow down and worship the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. If you did, fine. If you didn't, you would be cast alive into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. Let's think about what a burning, fiery furnace might be. I mean, we're not talking here about a barbecue that you might have at home that maybe gets to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. We're talking about something that's probably a crematorium meant to incinerate bones, 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Or maybe a furnace that was used for smelting metals, 2,200, 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit. Imagine yourself in that situation. You have a choice. You can bow down and go on with your life. Or you can choose not to bow down and be thrown into a burning, fiery furnace. I know for me, that would be a challenge. I'd probably bow down. So what did Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah do? Well, they didn't bow down. And what happened from that? The story doesn't end there. Some jealous colleagues hauled them before the king and said, "Nebuchadnezzar, these men don't serve you. They don't care about you. They don't respect you. They don't worship your image." So now, in front of the king, they had to do it all again. How often does that happen in our lives? Perhaps you've faced the same thing over and over again, and you're like, why does this keep coming up? Why is my faith being challenged again? So they were given a second chance before Nebuchadnezzar. It's interesting. He said to them, "Is it true that you didn't bow down like everyone else? Like, did you not understand the instructions? It was pretty straightforward. Music plays, you bow down. Did you miss the memo?" So he gives them a second chance. He says, "Look, we'll do it all again here. We'll cue the music, all right? You hear the music, you bow down. If you don't, you get thrown into the middle of a burning, fiery furnace." And I like what he says at the end of that passage. In Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar challenges them. He says, "And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands?" The response of Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah is one for the ages. It shows a complete and absolute faith and confidence in their God, regardless of the outcome. What did they say? It says they answered the king, "Nebuchadnezzar, we don't really need to answer you. Our lives have been consistent. We came here, you changed our names, you tried to change our diet. You've changed lots of things, but one thing that's been consistent is our confidence in our God. That's never changed. We really shouldn't have to answer you, but we will." They said, "Our God whom we serve, he is able to deliver us, and we believe he will. We're not going to worship your idol. Then they went on to say, and this is the part that really is amazing, even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow down to your God. No matter what, our faith and our confidence in our God is supreme over all. They didn't only serve God when it was good. It was a 24/7 kind of faith, through thick and thin, sickness and health. No matter what, we'll trust in God. That he knows what's best for us. It may be different than what we intended, but we believe that he knows what's best. That's the kind of faith that can conquer fear. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was understandably enraged. He'd just been embarrassed in front of all these officials. So what did he do? Well, he was going to carry out his word, but he even did more than that. He heated the furnace 7 times hotter than it was meant to be heated. He took these young men, these innocent, helpless young men, and bound them with ropes. He got his mightiest men, the strongest men in Babylon, to carry them and throw them into the furnace. How ironic that it's those mighty men of Babylon that were died just getting close to the flames. And the response of God is amazing. Pretty soon, the ropes burned off, and they were in the fire, walking around, free. God even sent an angel to help them. So when Nebuchadnezzar and officials looked into the fire, there was another in the fire, as 4 men walked around. So Nebuchadnezzar calls them out and says, "Come, your God is greater than I could have ever imagined." But it wasn't just that. The response of God was amazing. This wasn't a just barely by the skin of their teeth kind of deliverance. This was complete and thorough. Their clothes weren't burned, even though the ropes burned off. Their hair wasn't singed. They didn't even smell like fire. So I think this is a beautiful example of what faith is. It's knowing your God well enough through observation and experience to know that he can deliver you out of any situation. But even if he doesn't, you have confidence that he knows what's best for you. Let's be honest. Trials in life will sometimes hurt. There'll be times when we will get burned. But true biblical faith overcomes these fears, the stresses and the anxieties that can cause. It relieves that stress and gives us peace when fear can otherwise overwhelm us. Knowing and trusting that God is in control, that he is faithful to his promise, to always know what is best for us. This assurance of faith triumphs over fear. Reminds me of a verse in Scripture, and maybe Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were reciting this verse as they were heading off to Babylon and as they were facing this situation in their life. It's in Isaiah 43, verse 2, and it says, "When you pass through the waters, I'll be with you. And through the rivers, they'll not overthrow you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flame will not scorch you." What a beautiful assurance God had given them. Did you notice what it says, though? God promises to bring us through the trials. You know, if you're like me, you like to try and find a way around them to avoid them. But God says he'll be with us through these experiences. He knows what's best. He's molding and shaping us, refining our character so that we'll be the people he wants us to be. This is biblical faith. It's not blind. It's the kind of faith that assurance God gives us if we trust him implicitly. See his faithfulness demonstrated in our lives, the experiences of our lives, good and bad, and are willing to walk out to the wall while knives are thrown our way. Thank you. you.